What's going on? Welcome to Tech with Sean, and today we're building a beast of a 1440p gaming PC here in the Hyte Y40 Snow White Edition case. I'm going to run through the parts real quick and then we'll get it put together and see how it performs. For the CPU, at 1440p it does make more difference than it does at 4K, and so I'm going with the Ryzen 7800X3D. This takes less power than the newest Intel chips, it's cheaper, and it pushes more frames in most games, so it's a kind of a no-brainer. Then for the motherboard, I'm using an Asus B650. It's a pretty good bang for the buck. I don't need anything super fancy. I've heard that the Asus boards at the beginning of this generation did have some problems with giving too much power to the CPU and possibly killing them. But I've been assured by comments on Reddit and in the reviews that the newest BIOS updates have fixed this, so I'm rolling the dice. The power supply is kind of overkill. We're going with the 1000 watt Fantex. And you really don't need 1000 watts for this build, but that is going to leave it plenty of room for upgrading in the future. So, down the line, if I want to drop in a 9800X3D or a 5090 or something, we'll have enough juice to do it. Speaking of GPUs, we're going with the Gigabyte Aero RTX 4080. I thought that, the 4090 would make sense with this power supply and processor, but for 1440p, when you're not in path traced games, it really doesn't deliver that 40% margin. It's really more like 10 to 15% faster. So I just thought better bang for the buck at 1440p is the 4080. Obviously better bang for the buck would be AMD's cards probably, but I do like the NVIDIA features and like messing with ray tracing and all that. So I just decided to go with the 4080. For the cooling, I'm going with this Leon Lee setup. I've got the Galahad 2 Trinity SL Int 360, whatever that means. It's their 360mm AIO with the infinity fans. And then I've got another infinity fan for the rear exhaust, and then two of the reverse blade infinity fans for intake on the side panel. The RAM, I've got a 32 gig dual channel kit from Team Group, and it's got some RGB, so that's always a bonus. The storage, I've got a real mix going on. I've got a 1 terabyte Samsung drive I'm using for the boot, which is like an OEM version of the 980, I guess. It came out of a Legion laptop. Then I've got a 2 terabyte 980 that I'm going to use for like modern games that utilize direct storage. Then I've got a general purpose 4 terabyte silicon power drive that I'll use for most of my game library. So altogether 7 terabytes of storage. So that about wraps it up. We're going to have the 7800X3D, 4080, 32 gigs of RAM, 7 terabytes of storage, and we're going to have a really sweet case and enough power that it'll be easily upgradable in the future. So with all that said, let's get this thing put together. Okay, first off, I just went ahead and unboxed the stuff so I could get everything put together. The big pieces, the case, the processor, the graphics card, motherboard, all that stuff. Prepping for the build. Next, I went ahead and prepped the case. We took the riser cable assembly all the way out to make it easier to install the motherboard. You can see here one of the fans came with the blade totally disattached. I went ahead and popped it back on and it seems to work, but we're not really using these anyway. But that is kind of concerning to question what might have happened during shipping. Next, I went ahead and dropped in the motherboard. It's a standard ATX board and fits perfectly inside this case. No real issues there. After I had the motherboard installed, I went ahead and dropped in the 7800X3D. It's pretty straightforward. They're now using the Intel style LGA socket. After that, went ahead and installed our RAM, just the dual channel DDR5. Looking good so far. Next, we're doing the SSDs, so I went ahead and took out all the heat sinks, dropping in the 3 drives that we're going to use. Then remounting the heat sinks back on there. Next, I'm taking out that fan that we're not really going to use, and we're going to install the SL120 Infinity fans. Now this first one I'm doing here, it's kind of ill-fated. You'll see later on in the build that we weren't able to actually include this fan due to size constraints. but they are some nice looking fans. You do want to be careful not to scratch up the mirrored edges too much because they're just made of plastic, so if you get any deep gouges on there, they're going to be there forever. They did include some kind of like protective things you can put over them, like screen protectors almost, but I didn't mess with that. They look kind of goofy if you ask me. Now we've got the 360 rad going in, and I already had to take out the rear fan to fit the radiator in the top. This is pretty straightforward. It's just like any other 360 AIO. You just hold it up there, put in a bunch of screws, run your wires out the backside. Now I was able to fit the fan back in with the radiator, but the graphics card ended up being too tall to squeeze it all in there together. Finishing that up. Now let's see. Now we're going to put our reverse bladed fans in, and these are just going to be on the side for air intake. So we're going to have air coming in from the side panel and then being exhausted out of the top. There's also the fan underneath by the power supply, so you get a kind of chimney effect where the air comes in from the bottom and out the top. Now it's time for the thermal paste. Leon Lee gives you these templates that you can use to spread the paste, but I just went ahead and threw those in the trash and squirted a bunch on there and used the paddle to flatten it out. I prefer doing that, especially with a big chip like this, because you're going to ensure you get good coverage. After this, we're just mounting and screwing on the pump block for the AIO. It's pretty straightforward. The AM5 bracket is pretty easy to work with if you ask me. You just got to make sure you get the little hinges over the nubs, or whatever the technical term is. Now we're just routing some cables for the AIO. You're going to go ahead and put the riser cable deal back inside, and it's pretty easy. You just pop it in, screw it in, and screw the little PCI slot thing down. Now it's time for the 4080, and this is a big card, and even though this case fits the card no problem, having all the other stuff in there, you can see here I was having troubles with the fan, and that fan we ended up not being able to use. And actually the little metal fingers on the graphics card wouldn't fit. Had to take some metal snips and actually cut those little tabs off so that it would fit into the case. Hopefully you don't have to do this on your card, but I don't know if it's just because it's a really big card or what, but yeah, had to snip the ends off. Here you can see I'm realizing that 120 is not going to fit, and I'm just taking it out. Gonna plug in our 12 volt high power connector. And with that, we're pretty much done and ready to fire it up. Here I am, getting it all plugged up, ready to boot for the first time. The anticipation is killing me. I know sometimes the Ryzen builds take forever because of the oh, there we go. We got BIOS. Awesome. Now this part caused me some problems. I got an error that said the FTPM PSP NV is corrupted, and it said press Y to reset. And I kept pressing Y, and for some reason my keyboard, even though it was hooked in with a USB cable, was not being recognized by the BIOS. This confused the crap out of me and set me back like a couple of hours. I messed around with this for a long time, and it ended up I just needed to use a different keyboard, so I used a totally wireless keyboard with a dongle, and then it worked the very first time. Alright, we're back. It's actually a couple of days later. I made a couple of noob mistakes, and I got Windows and a bunch of games installed and got everything up and running. So, first of all, on the Leon Lee fan controller, I forgot to take the extra cable out of the box and hook it up from the USB-C to the USB 2 header, so I only had it hooked up to the SATA header, so there were no lights or no control or anything, so I had to take it back apart, put that in, and then when I did that, I went ahead and swapped out the bottom case fan with the extra 120 infinity fan because I couldn't fit the rear exhaust fan in there. There wasn't enough height clearance with the GPU, so it was just too tall. If you had a smaller graphics card, you could probably fit a rear fan in there, but it was really tight between the 360 radiator and the graphics card, so just couldn't make it happen. Put it in the bottom, so now I have some speed control and it gives it a little bit of an underglow, so that's cool. What else? There was some GPU sag a little bit, so I cut a little piece of plastic tubing that's just clear and stuck it under there, and seems to be doing a really good job so far, and it looks good. Overall, pretty happy with it. Let's jump into some gameplay though. The graphics card came with a free copy of Alan Wake 2, so we'll go ahead and check that out. Check out some Cyberpunk, Hogwarts, and a few other hard-to-run games and see how it performs. Starting off with Alan Wake 2, you can see here we're running through the forest. This is one of the most demanding scenes of the game, more so than the cities. And jumping into the settings, we've got this running at 1440p. We have the settings on the highest preset. And let's see, DLSS is on, frame generation is on. But we're not upscaling with DLSS, we're just using DLAA. Let's see, everything's turned up. Shadows by default are on medium instead of high on the highest preset, so I went ahead and turned those up. And going back into the game, you'll see we're getting right around 60 frames per second. It will dip a little below 60 at times with everything turned up and the shadow detail up and everything. But it's very playable, especially for this type of game, and if you really need 60, you could always turn a couple of settings down if you wanted to keep it on the native resolution with DLAA. But you could totally play it like this. It looks amazing also, the lighting and the forest and everything. But coming into here, we're gonna go ahead and drop the rendering resolution with DLSS down to quality, but keep everything else maxed out. And you'll see that makes a big difference, and now we're getting close to 80 frames per second, so that's a much better experience, I'd say, but either way you're going to be happy playing on the 4080. Next is Cyberpunk, and we're on 1440p on the Ray Tracing Overdrive preset, and we're going to set the DLSS upscaling to quality. We have frame generation off right now. And with those settings, we'll pull right around 60 frames in this first scenario here. It will drop below it a little bit. Again, for this kind of game, I think that would be acceptable if you wanted to play it at the native resolution with everything turned up, especially if you have variable refresh rate display. But it is pretty intense on your GPU trying to run this with the full path tracing and everything. Coming on here to the end of this benchmark, we'll see what kind of average we got. And 65 frames per second. So that's a decent average, but there were definitely some dips there. So coming back into the benchmark, this time same settings but with frame generation enabled, and you'll see that there's a huge boost to the frame rate, and it's getting close to 100 frames in this first scene. Still looks really good, just a little bit smoother. There may be some artifacts here and there, but it's pretty hard to pick out unless you're just looking for them. The smoothness though is vastly improved with the frame generation, and it still looks really good. I mean, these path traced reflections, it's really a huge step up from what it used to look like. I'm not sure if that's all ray reconstruction or path tracing or a combination of both, but either way, it looks good, and we get an average of 106 frames with frame generation enabled, so that's a really big boost from 65. Next we have Hogwarts Legacy, and we've got this at 1440p native with DLAA anti-aliasing, no upscaling. And in the graphics settings, we've got everything on ultra, ray tracing, all three kinds turned up, and on ultra quality. So we're pushing it pretty much as hard as you can. And running around outside here, we'll get about 60 frames per second. Feels pretty nice. This isn't some competitive game, so, you know, as long as your frame rate is around 60, I think it feels pretty good. But when you do some certain things, you know, this game has intense effects. For instance, I'm going to capture a Kneasel here, and you'll see that after I cast the thing and put the Kneasel in the bag, or whatever you would say, there's a lot of particle effects and lighting and stuff, and you'll see the frame rate drop way down to the 40s or 30s. And you know, most of the game that's not going to be the case, but it will be the case when there's super intense stuff going on. One thing you can do would be to go in and drop a few settings. I've tried turning the ray tracing down to high, and that will bump you back up a few more frames per second. But you could always enable the frame generation in this game also, and that's going to make a bigger difference to the feeling of smoothness than tweaking a couple of settings. You could also use DLSS quality or some form of upscaling. There's a variety of ways you could claw back some frames in this game. But this isn't really the most intense part of the game either, so let's jump on over to Hogsmeade. And I came here and did a run down the main street, and we kept up about 60 to 70 frames per second the whole time. Again, turning on frame generation would give you a huge boost and kind of a game-changing amount of frames, but I just wanted to see how this performed without it, and it held up quite respectfully. Next is Starfield, and this is the new Crisis basically, because it'll push about any graphics card as far as you want it to go. And we're running this on the Ultra preset, but with dynamic resolution turned off. And also by default FSR2 is enabled, so I went ahead and turned that off. So this is 1440p Ultra, no dynamic resolution and no resolution scaling. And indoors here, we're going through some gunfights with some spacers, and the frame rate's staying up in the 80s to 90s mostly, which is pretty good for this game. Granted, there are places in the cities where it's much more intensive than it is when you're in a building interior like this, going through the missions. So, while you're going to have plenty of frames in a situation like this, let's jump over to Aquila City next, and we'll see how it fares there. Okay, here we are, coming into Aquila City, and this is a more intense part of the game. There's a lot more people walking around, a little more geometry. I think it has to load up more stuff. However, the Bethesda game magic works. The cities are more intense. Pretty common with lots of RPGs. You'll see here with the scanner up and all the people, the frame rate did drop below 60 for a second there, but I don't think anything like that is too much to worry about. And I wouldn't drop my graphics settings just because it dipped under 60 one or two times. As you can see, overall this is a very good experience even in the densely populated areas. And so I think this combination of the 7800X3D and 4080 is doing a pretty good job here. You will notice though in Starfield that our GPU utilization drops a little bit from 100, so we are a little bit CPU limited. Next up, Forza Horizon 5, and this is a pretty well optimized game and you'll be able to push tons of frames with this, but I thought this would be an interesting one to include because it's not as hard on the GPU as you might think. It will be able to crank out a ton of frames, but you can see here our utilization is dropping into the 90, 94, 93%. So the 7800X3D actually can't even push the 4080 as far as it could possibly go. And if you have a future CPU, maybe you'll be able to get even more frames per second on the same setup. But either way, right now we're getting 155 frames on 1440p Extreme, and it feels very fluid and responsive, and I think you'd be happy playing that game on this setup. Next up, we got Modern Warfare 2, and we're running it at 1440p on pretty high settings. You can see what all we have it set at here, but if you were playing this competitively, you'd likely drop some of the settings down, but I just wanted to see what this was capable of. And going into the game itself, we're getting anywhere from 150 to 200 frames per second, depending on what's being rendered on the screen, and it feels really good. You could get closer to that 240 frames, I'm sure, if you turn some settings down, because it looks like our GPU is maxed out, so if we did turn some graphic effects down, we would be able to push some more frames with that CPU. Very responsive, good frame time graph, and had no problems or complaints about playing some Warzone 2 on this setup. And if you're good enough maybe you'll even be able to pull out the Warzone victory in that Battle Royale on this system. Now, of course, the setup can run an MMO, but I had to run the Final Fantasy XIV benchmark just to see what kind of crazy frame rate we would get. You can see here it's pushing over 300 frames per second on maximum settings 1440p. I don't know if there even are any 300Hz 1440p monitors, are there? I mean, I know we have the 240Hz OLEDs, but if you did have one, you'd be able to take pretty good advantage of 300Hz at 1440p, even on maximum settings here in a game like this. We came in with the extremely high benchmark score of 36,244. Extremely high. Like whoever came up with the design for the cactar. Next up, Red Dead Redemption 2. This is still the most next-gen looking last-gen game, and we got this turned up with pretty much the highest settings, everything except, you know, like the full resolution, ambient occlusion or whatever, but 1440p, really high settings, and it's pushing over 120 frames per second. Here in the building interior, we're getting 130, 140 frames, and in the outdoors, it drops just a little bit down to, well, it actually didn't drop that much. We're still pushing about 140 frames per second. That's really impressive for this game. It's still quite a looker, even several years later. Coming up here at the end of the benchmark, these trees are pretty taxing on the GPU when you have everything turned up, but still managing to keep it over 120 frames per second. Let's see what the final tally here says. So the average is 134 frames per second. If it were me, I would probably use Rivatuner or something and lock it to 120, but either way, that's a really good experience for Red Dead 2. So as you can see, the 7800X3D and 4080 really did a great job for 1440p gaming. With this power supply, it is a 1000 watt A-tier power supply, and the 7800X3D is a really good chip. You could definitely do a 4090 in there if you wanted to, but I feel like at 1440p, the 4090 was like $700 more. I got this one for $1199, and I don't think you'd get $700 worth of difference at 1440p. You would notice a pretty decent difference in ray trace and path traced games, but in a lot of rasterized games, you might only see 5-10% difference, and there were instances where we were still CPU limited, like Forza Horizon 5 and some other games, so really, unless you got 4K, I think the 4090 is still kind of overkill, and with this build, it's on AM5, and it has that 1000 watt power supply, so instead of spending the $700 now on the 4090, I could just put that towards a 50 series card since those are only a year away. And you know, if they come out with a 8800X3D or 9800X3D, I should be able to drop those in there too. So it has the bones to be upgraded in the future. And I think that for right now, the 4080 and on the AMD side, the 7900 XTX probably, those are really good cards for 1440p gaming, so you can spend more, but you don't really have to, and you can still get a really high-end experience. But I'm really happy with how it looks. It's quiet. I'm running the fans on quiet mode in the Leon Lee software, and I have the graphics card on the quiet BIOS, so the fans don't really spin up until it gets up to about 70C, and sitting right there on my desk, the noise level is really acceptable, so performance is there. The noise is there, I really like the looks, and it's upgradable, so should be good to go for a while, and I'm pretty happy with the build. Let me know what you think in the comments. It's been a while since I made a video, so I'm glad to be able to bring some content back for y'all. Yeah, drop a comment, give it a like, and I'll catch you in the next one.